Hello and welcome to the Identity Manager Basics video series. In this small set of videos, I like to talk about the installation of the Identity Manager. What we will do here is we will look how to install the Identity Manager on a workstation and on the database server. We will have a look at installing Identity Manager services. And at the end, we will have a look at how to install Identity Manager web frontends. In the very last part, which is not really installation anymore, we will talk about how to deinstall the Identity Manager, what could be of interest from a demo perspective. Before we can start with the installation, it is a really cool idea to talk about some theoretically basics. The first question should be, should I install the Identity Manager? In a demo environment, of course, yes, but productively, it is an option. The reason for is we have a wonderful product for you that is called Identity Manager on Demand. And Identity Manager on Demand, it's a fully functional Identity Manager installation, cloud hosted. That means you can just order from one identity, such an Identity Manager on Demand installation. You can connect your on-prem environment to this installation, and you can then at the end use the Identity Manager. The whole thing, it's cloud hosted. That means all system maintenance and backups and whatever else will happen in our data centers so that you have not to do all the admin tasks. With that, Identity Manager on Demand is an option you should choose if you like to. The next question is to talk about where you can get help. And at the end, you can get help from support.oneidentity.com. There are manuals, there are knowledge entries, there are release notes, and of course, you can get access to the basic trainings as well. With that, support.oneidentity.com should be your first choice. Additionally to that exists the support where you can get help from experienced people. And you can as well find some videos, like on the YouTube channel, which is our last option, but I nearly think you found it. Before we can start, again, we should talk about some, let me say it, best practices. First of all, what instance to be used to install the Identity Manager? The Identity Manager setup set just sets a lot of configurations, and these configurations typically slows down other databases and increases the performance of the Identity Manager database. Because of that, it is common sense and a very good idea to install the Identity Manager database in its own single instance on the SQL Server. Additionally to that, ensure that for this instance, the SQL Server agent is up and running and able to access the database, because the Identity Manager half part is a lot of calculation jobs in a calculation engine, which is triggered and maintained by the SQL Server agent. Log files and database files can be separated. In the past, this was very typical, especially if the server the installation happens to had more than one physical hard drive. In the meantime, it depends. You have to figure out if you can separate the data storages one from the other, and only if the data storage is completely separated, then it could be that log and database files separated make sense. If both files just lay on other partitions on the same hard drive or on the same data store, then you don't need to start with these type of efforts. For people who are using hardware and use old RAID 5s, please know that RAID 5 is pretty slow, and because of that, it is not good enough from a performance perspective for the Identity Manager, and because of that, use something different. There are in the meantime different RAID types as well available, or you can use wonderful network storages with a very high performance in the meantime. Whatever you use, ensure it will automatically have the maximum performance from a file I/O perspective, because databases needs that to be performant. Backups should happen all the time. And the typical way to back up a database is to do a backup on a hard drive and then to stream from that hard drive, for example, the backup to a tape media. If you try to back up your database directly to a tape media, that will slow down your database again during the complete backup process. Knowing that, ensure that always the backup happens to another hard drive than the database lays on, and that this hard drive later on gets streamed to your media. A lot of people are as well installing antivirus systems. That makes a lot of sense, even on servers, but please ensure that database files and database log files are always excluded from virus scanning. Both are big text blocks. It is not possible to execute them. With that, it is not possible to get a virus at the end by the execution of these databases installed. And because of that, they should be excluded. If this not happens, because you are a very careful person, then the following will happen. You access your database. The database might have a size of 3 GB, and with the first access, all 3 GB get scanned. With the next access, happens 5 seconds later, the same 3 GB get scanned. That means at the end, your virus scanner will scan all the time your database, and that will slow your file I/O, and this will slow down your Identity Manager installation. Because of that, ensure antivirus scanners should always exclude database files and log files completely independent if this is the Identity Manager or another database. If you use a virtual environment, it makes as well sense to use static resources in an assignment. That means ensure that there is not a swapped or at the end a dynamical assignment of system resources like CPU power and RAM that happens to your database server. All of these management processes to get more or to drop additionally resources slows down database servers, and because of that they are not really a good idea. If you like to create the Identity Manager database, there is a setup set tool that is doing all the steps for you. It is possible, especially with specific database administrators as well, to use a pre-created database, but honestly, that often leads to more problems than it is helpful. With that, our suggestion is use our installer to create your database as well, and later on use another account with less permissions to operate your database. Last but not least, all of these Identity Manager systems needs a lot of performance, and they have to run more or less 7 days, 24 hours, and because of that it is important to monitor them. There is a lot of monitoring software available in the internet or from other vendors. You can install them, you can directly monitor all your systems, you can monitor the performance, and that is something you should do. I will not talk about that in this installation videos because that is knowledge of other products. The performance is important. Performance typically covers 3 different things: CPU power, enough RAM, and file I/O performance. All of them should be available in a mass, especially because you all need them. The Identity Manager is a high-class database. It needs any single performance it can acquire. And now please allow me to give you the last instructions. There is the Identity Manager manual. In the Identity Manager manual, all prerequisites are described. Prerequisites about hardware, prerequisites of course about software, prerequisites about permissions you need for service accounts and such. Please plan that all properly. Ensure that your complete platform and all the software which needs to be connected to the Identity Manager is pre-installed and well configured, because the Identity Manager will then connect to all of them as configured. The Identity Manager always is at the end of the list. That means if something other else in front of works not really perfect, like an operating system or a platform system, this will automatically have effect and harm the Identity Manager as well. And now let's start with the demo part of our installation. As you can see, there's a virtual environment in front of us. The virtual environment from the left to the right is an Active Directory domain controller and exchange server, a database server we use for the database, an application server IMS03, which is used then for web apps later on. There's a SharePoint machine, we will not use that. And there's a Linux box IMS10, which is just used for file space and a lot of business applications we use for documentation in this environment. On the very right hand side of the picture, there's IMW01, that is our Windows workstation, we will use more or less 90% of all the time. What we like to do is, we want to install first on the IMW01 all the client tools we need for the Identity Manager installation as an admin workstation. Then we will use the workstation to migrate a database on IMSO2. That means install the database, add the complete schema to and such. This will then end part 1. In part 2, we will then install another server service on IMSO3, at least to admin the IMSO1, which is our Active Directory domain controller. And we will as well activate a synchronization with the Active Directory so that there is one target system at least connected to the Identity Manager. In part 3 of the story, we will then use the web installer to install on IMSO3 a lot of web applications, and we will talk about this. Last but not least, in part 4 of the series, I will show you how to get rid of all of these Identity Manager tools from a demo environment perspective. And now let's start. Therefore, I like to switch to my admin workstation. This is IAMW01, and this is the workstation we work on. As you can easily see, there is no Identity Manager installed. So if I, for example, look into the Start menu and scroll down a little bit where one identity should typically reside, then you can easily see there is nowhere a one identity folder. That means there is no one identity tool installed. So now let's start the installation. What's necessary to do so? Necessary is a setup set. Typically a setup set is something you will find somewhere on the server. That means I just step into the internet. There I need the one identity page. That will be typically enough, but if you want to make it a little bit better and easier for you, then you should know that all software exists at the support portal of one identity. And so I take the subdomain support1identity.com. If I jump to that specific page, then you will easily see there is a section for Identity Manager. It's here underneath of Identity Governance and Administration. If I step to that, on the very right hand side of the portal, you will find Download Software. There is the Identity Manager 8.2, which is the current version recording that video. You can see you can download the Identity Manager here. You have only to click on Add to Download. You can as well have a look at some manuals here. But to download the software is good enough. And if the software is downloaded, trust me, you will make that without my help. Then you will find the software as a big zip file that looks more or less like this. It's a zip file. And if you just extract all the files from the zip file, then you get something we call here in that specific training the installation DVD. That is our installation DVD. You see here, there's the autorun exe. And the autorun exe is what we will start with. With a double click on the autorun exe, the setup set starts, and here you can see that my admin workstation is perfectly prepared. That means there is no additional message which points out to install a tool that is called Microsoft Edge WebView 2. This could happen if this is first time on that workstation you run the Identity Manager. Microsoft Edge WebView 2, it's a standalone tool. It is standalone from Microsoft Edge, by the way. And this tool needs to be installed if you want to run that specific web installer. That installer here will prompt you in cases when WebView 2 is not installed. You can then use the installer to install WebView as a prerequisite, and then the installer will start. You can as well do that manually by downloading WebView 2 from Microsoft. That is all possible. At the end, you saw there is no error message, and that means all the prerequisites was perfectly installed. What we can see there? We can see there system requirements. That might be helpful. Please look as well into the documentation of the Identity Manager. These system requirements are, as you can see, the minimum requirements, and what stands not in the header is that these are the minimum requirements for a productive environment. This means that all requirements here are not necessary to fulfill to install a demo environment. Therefore, you can use something with less resources. But these are the minimum requirements if you want to install a small productive environment. At the end, all of these requirements are helpful, but they will only help to install your environment productively. Finally, you have always to think about what is planned. That means how many objects you want to handle, more or less. and how many target systems you want to connect, whatever. Very often, in the meantime, environments gets hosted in virtual environments. Their resources are not really a problem because you can add easily resources to your installation. But nevertheless, please have always a look into that, especially into the software requirements before you start to install the Identity Manager. Identity Manager is always at the end of the installation line. That means it handles with all the software components underneath. If some prerequisites are not fulfilled, you will see errors in the Identity Manager, which are not the case of a bug situation. These are errors because some prerequisites are not fulfilled, and so prerequisites and minimum requirements are always a good sign to look into. Same thing like the release notes, by the way, because even in the release notes you will find some prerequisites. Documentation is exactly this. You will find the complete documentation in a browser. You can just look into them before you start to install something, and please have always a look into the release notes. Release notes are always pretty helpful. We will skip installation. That is the last point we will discuss. Look into other products. As you can see, there are Identity Manager related other products. We see here editions, so named Active Directory Edition. This is only because of compatibility. That means upward compatibility available for people who was installing such an Identity Manager Active Directory Edition. In the meantime, this edition exists not anymore. It is an old product. We see here as well one Identity Manager history database. This is not a one Identity Manager installation, and it is an extension to the Identity Manager, and it allows to install a history database. History databases are used just to drop out from the main database historical data to keep the main database slim and to store them historically in 1 to n other databases. Of course, all of these history databases are connected to the Identity Manager, and because of that, the history can be seen in all of the front ends, but the data are stored in a different database if I like to. Again, history database is not necessary to do the history. That works as well with the main database. History database is only used as a storage for old history data you want to cave out from the Identity Manager database. One Identity Distributable of STS. It's a security tool for webs. That is something that gets shipped with the Identity Manager as well, and it is in that other product section because it is from Quest as well. On the add-on section of the setup DVD, you will then find all the add-ons. These are typically add-ons from other software vendors, things like SAP resources or Oracle resources, or Google Workspace resources, all stuff, APIs, and whatever else is necessary to connect other systems. As we are able to ship them, we ship them together with the DVD. Please have always a look into the manual. It could be that the one or the other component need to be downloaded from the foreign vendor, especially if we have not the allowance to ship these things with the DVD. Support is what the name says. You will here find some pages, for example, to connect to support or check for updates or whatever else things. You will as well find a button for the Get Online Support line here. And at the end, if you step to contact us, then you are able to contact One Identity. Now let's just jump back to the main important button in this installer, and that is what we use in 99% of all purpose, and this is installation. As you can easily see here in the installation section, there are two editions available. One Identity Manager Data Governance Edition and One Identity Manager. Both are installing the Identity Manager. The difference between the one and the other is just the pre-configuration. One Identity Manager Data Governance Edition just installs data governance, which is one of the functionalities of the Identity Manager, and it pre-configures the system that it works best with data governance only. If you install the One Identity Manager, you will not get data governance out of the box, but you will get more of the Identity Manager. That means all the Identity Manager functionality besides some not checked functions. At the end, it makes no difference if you install the One Identity Manager Data Governance Edition or the One Identity Manager. Reason for that is you can add to each of both installations all the modules you want and you will get exactly the same result. And because of that, typically I always choose to install the One Identity Manager. The reason for is I get more modules installed, and if I need data governance, I just click that on top in a second run. On the very bottom of that specific screen, you can see the web-based components installer. That is something we will see in video 3 when I install web applications. And now let's start installing the Identity Manager. Therefore, I click here on Install and my Setup Set tool will start the installer. Here we are. This installer is the first part of the installation of the Identity Manager, and it installs all the client components. That means all the admin components on my admin workstation. I'm signed in, you can see that here on IMW01, which is my admin workstation. English is pre-selected, that is good with us. We just click on next, and what happens is I see a license agreement. Yes, of course, if you are a lawyer, please feel free to read all of that and hopefully you are able to understand it. We all know that if we don't check the box here for a license agreement, we will not able to be installed, and this is exactly the same case in the Identity Manager. With the next button, we just go to the next screen where we select our setup resource. Remember, we started the installer from the DVD, and because of that, automatically the folder where the DVD resides is pre-selected. The green check marks here says that on the one hand side, in the program files folder, that means here, second part, program files, one identity manager, there are no applications yet, and that means the folder is prepared for the installation. We see as well a green check mark for the installation resource. That is the thing on the top. That means this installer approves that the installation resource looks like complete. More options on the button. There is on the one hand side, select installation modules with the existing database. This is something you should always select if you just upgrade something. That means there's already an Identity Manager installation available and you want to upgrade this installation. In these cases, this select installation modules with the existing database is necessary. Secondly, there is add more modules to the selected edition. This is as well if you have an available edition and you want to add something. For example, on a second try, you want to add the data governance functionality to the Identity Manager. In this case, then you can as well select add more modules to the selected edition. For an initial installation, and that is what we do right now, it is not a really good idea to check one of these boxes. Many reasons for. First of all, the first box, we don't have an installation, so there is nothing to read. Secondly, the second box. Here, in the second box, we can add more modules to our installation. That is possible. But unfortunately, there are always sometimes dependencies between what we install to the database with the help of this box and what we have installed on the machine. So my personal suggestion is let these boxes as they are. Install your components default. And if you want to add something, run the installer again. This will lead to less error situations, but if you don't do that because you are not that patient than I am, then in this very specific case, you can just solve all the problems that will appear by a second run of the installer as well. So I click on next and I get a form that allows me now to select which components on my admin workstation need to be installed. On an admin workstation, typically the documentation is always something I need. And of course, all the workstation components are as well something I want to install on a workstation. In case of the server, I don't want to install an Identity Manager job server, but what I like to install are the configuration tools of these job servers because they can as well be used to remotely control and configure services later on. And so I install all the workstation components, plus the tools I need for server configuration and of course the documentation. With that, I have a wonderful pre-selection. I can install less and more. That's up to you what you want to do. But I think with this selection, you are good. Next thing here is to talk about the Identity Manager service. Oh gosh, what's that? Identity Manager service. This screen is something I get because I was checking the service tools. Typically, if you don't select something about the service, you will not see that. But in this very specific case, I get that as well. I let it as the default is. I don't need it because I will not register a service later on. But it is something that is depending on the subtree of these service components. Now all the files gets installed. That means all the binaries here gets copied from the setup DVD directly into the program files One Identity Manager folder. And at the end, next is available as well. And you see here the One Identity Manager end screen, which allows me now to start the configuration wizard and the job service configuration. What you might have seen as well was that I was speeding up the time between just the start of the installation and the end of the installation. This is something I can easily do in a video, and that will lead to the fact that you get not a very boring video with long pauses between the different tasks. This will happen many times, but at the end I will show you when we started and when we ended the installation. Now the second part of the installation starts, and the second part of the installation is to install the database. Therefore, I need the configuration wizard. This is the only making sense option on the screen. To configure a job service is something that might be helpful in an update installation or such, but for an initial installation, we cannot install, or we should not install, job services before we install the database. And so we just hit the button Run for the configuration wizard. The configuration wizard itself is an additional tool, and it will start to create the database. Once the configuration wizard is started, we have the option to create and install a new database. That is the first part, or we can update an existing database. Both it's possible. In our case, we can only install the database because there's no database yet, but at the end, both is available. Please have in mind, this configuration wizard is only a tool that allows to install the database and one first server service, even in an update case. It is not possible to install client tools with this tool, and so it is the second tool in a row in an initial installation. So we choose Create and Install a Database, click Next, and gets asked what our server for the database is. Remember, it was IMS 02. And we need as well a database user and a password to access that specific server. Such database users, passwords, and the permissions that these accounts need is something you got from your administration, in this case the database admins. If you don't have them, you have to request for. Therefore, all the prerequisites in the manual are helpful. They tell you what accounts you need and what permissions they should have. With the right configuration, I can then step next. Please let me as well talk about the Windows authentications buttons here. Windows authentication to connect to a database, it's a very painful thing. From my perspective, it is a big security leak if you just do that, especially because it allows that Active Directory users can directly connect the database. Nevertheless, it is possible, but before you start thinking about these and maybe thinking about your Microsoft SQL courses you have had, please remember that Identity Manager is not using the SQL Server Platform security. It is using its own security, and so to deal with a local SQL account, it's much more secure and easier to handle than to handle Windows authentication. With Next, I can create my database. And to create my database, I need a database name. This is a default. The data directory, log directory, and memory table directory, that is all default configured on the SQL server. Hopefully your data admins did that. You can talk about a different initial size. For example, I know that my database is around, let me say 1 gigabyte, 1.5 gigabyte later on. And so I can, for example, request 5 gigabytes directly. But however, it makes no difference, because if you take the default, the SQL Server will size up the database if necessary. To change the installation source is available as an option, what you should better not do, but in some specific cases it could be. One last thing here is the Advanced button. The Advanced button allows to get more options. I will turn the advanced option right now on. I will get a little bit more screens than typical, but it is helpful to discuss everything. If I turn the advanced button on, as you can easily see on this very specific screen, nothing happens. I'm now able to select configuration modules. That means additional modules I want to install to the Identity Manager. As told before, it is not wise to do that in an initial installation. It is better just do it in a second run. And so I will let it as it is, especially because every additional module I check here will extend the installation time, and I want to show you a very fast demo. With next, I now step in a specific screen which allows me again to select a specific database user. Remember, the first database user I entered was a database user to create a database. This is already done. What I can now do is I can select a database user which will allow to operate the database. Typically, these users need less permissions because they have not to create and manage databases. However, in my very small demo environment, the best guess is, of course, to use the SQL Server login I used before, because I do all with the same SQL user. But if you want to act secure, then you have two more options. One is to create an extra new SQL user. That is a SQL user with less privileges, of course. You can as well add a password, as you can see. And the second option is to use an already available user, which a database admin might have just created for you. Whatever else you need, you have to know both users. That means the user we are using right now and the user the database admin was creating are at least, I like to say, configured with the minimum requirements for permissions for the SQL Server as described in the Identity Manager manual. Only with the first option, create new SQL Server login for the database, you are safe, because then the Identity Manager will automatically assign all the options to that new users which are necessary. Minimum requirements, by the way, are always minimum requirements to allow the maximum feature set. That means if you look into the manual, you will see a lot of options, and then you can choose which exactly permissions you need. But please be aware, if you just uncheck some of the options, it could be that the one or the other feature won't work. With that, I use my current user. There are enough privileges assigned to that user, and I click on Next. Right now, the system starts to install the complete database. That will take a while, and we will again speed up that complete process until it is nearly finished. A short interruption just for interested people. What you can see there is a back and forth switching between SQL commands, and then something that looks like a table. That specific table are calculation jobs within the database. They get calculated during the installation of the Identity Manager, and they will lead then to other configurations and other jobs to execute. This is something pretty normal. And of course, you see that only because I checked the Advanced button in the easy part of the installation. That means without Advanced checked, you will just see the circle of death as the only sign that something happens. In phase 1 of the installation, we just calculate all the steps that are necessary to install the database. That was creating a process list. In phase 2 of the installation, the complete database schema and everything necessary to run the Identity Manager was just installed. Now we are in phase 3 of the installation, and in phase 3, the complete setup DVD, that means all the binaries, gets uploaded to the Identity Manager database, which is necessary because the Identity Manager has a feature that is known as automatical update, and automatically updates all client tools automatically from the database if this is necessary. Latest then in phase 4, we will see a system compilation, which will wonder the one or the other, especially because SQL is an interpreter language and a compilation seems not to be necessary. What gets compiled there is VB.NET code. Remember, the Identity Manager has a lot of binaries. That is what is shipped with a setup DVD, but as well a lot of customizable and configurable components. And that is, for example, the complete data flow known as templates and such in the Identity Manager. All of these valuable and changeable content parts are very often SQL, or they are much more often VB.NET. And VB.NET is written in text, but you need to compile it into assembly DLLs. And that is what happens during the system compilation. That means if the complete content is stored in the database, all the out-of-the-box existing functionality and the complete schema is available, then the system compiler in phase 4 compiles all available VB.NET text in a way that it can be used. That means it creates these assembly DLLs, and also the assembly DLLs gets stored in the database so that they can be downloaded on demand every time they are needed. Once the database is completely installed, I can click on Next. And what will happen, I can start to configure the first steps in my database. The first thing I have to enter is a customer name. And secondly, I can just and need to set passwords for out-of-the-box existing users. These are system users. You can see them as accounts in the Identity Manager database, and they need passwords. Last but not least, this allows as well to create your own system users. That means out-of-the-box system users are quite nice, but if you work productively with an Identity Manager environment, you should have your personalized admin accounts for at least the people who are working with the database. That means from a configuration and customization perspective. And so I install here another system user, which is my system user. Once that is done, and only if the advanced button is checked, I can have as well a look on permission groups. There are permission groups. They are typically holding Identity Manager permissions. And we need some permission groups as well to assign later on customized extensions of the Identity Manager. Therefore, a view permission and edit permission and roles and such gets created. You can as well extend that here. Typically, people don't do that at this time. They do it later if they configure their database. And with that, I just let all the configuration as it is and click Next. Once this is done, on that screen, I can now deal with the database encryption. You know, in the Identity Manager, there are fields with valuable or with sensitive code. For example, password fields or such. Passwords gets of course hashed, but there might be other stuff as well available. I want to encrypt. Therefore, I can encrypt the database. And that means I will encrypt all columns and all tables marked for encryption. If this happens, then I can't see the values of these tables or columns anymore. That means if I look into the database, there's only encrypted stuff. And because of that, from an initial installation perspective, before I start going live, a database encryption from my perspective makes not sense. That is something I do shortly before I start with my productive environment. That means shortly in front of the go live. And with having that set, I just skip the database encryption here and step next. On that screen now, the last part of the installation starts. And the last part of the installation is starting just one Identity Manager service. Remember, we installed client tools on the workstation and we installed a database. And of course, the database is now fully available and works pretty well. But what is left is the communication between the Identity Manager and the outer world. That means all the machines around. That means all Active Directories and LDAPs and Exchange and SharePoints and whatever else other application you use. In this case, I need an agent which allows to communicate with these systems, and that is a server service. Typically, this is something I do later on in an installation, and we have an own video about it. It's part 2 of this installation series. At this time here, I want to talk about just one single service, and that single service is an exception because it targets the identity manager as a target system. Yes, that's right. The identity manager itself is as well a target system for the identity manager. That means it is necessary to have one server service available at least, which allows to execute database jobs. And these database jobs are then jobs from the identity manager. With that, the identity manager acts as a target system for the identity manager. Cool, well, so to make that available, I have to install a service. In this specific scenario, I install that service on an IMS02, which is my database server. It's the only server known right now in the database. Because of that, it is pre-selected. But I can as well enter other server names into that specific field if I like to. In a demo environment, it's quite typical to install a server service on the database server. In a production environment, you will typically not do that, especially because your database admin will be not really happy about such. And you can use whatever else other server name you like. The server name is necessary to reach out to the server, especially because the installation happens remotely. In our demo scenario, I'm fine with IMS02. And I have only to specify the account the server gets registered with and runs with. Again, why this is important? Typically, a server service gets registered as local system, which allows a service to access on an admin basis only the server where it gets installed to. Our server services communicate with other machines, that means other file shares, other computers and such, and so they need a domain account just to be able to talk to other machines. To do so, I was using one of these machines having that specific domain account. I should as well automatically let the system know which domain it's necessary. And I can as well, if I click on here, configure settings for a specific account which allows me to access the server. But what happens here is that I use this specific service account to install the service and to run the service with. If I have advanced checked, I can as well see the machine roles right here. In my very specific scenario, I don't want to synchronize Active Directory with that machine, but I can use it as a SCIM service, and I can use it and I want to use it with configuration tools. And as well, I can change, if I like to, the preset configuration of my specific service. For example, I can look into the configuration of the queue. I will talk about in video 2 what it is. And I can just say that this service should not look all 90 seconds into the database and look for new jobs. It should do that all 30 seconds. This is of course a configuration I better only configure in a demo environment where I'm the only user. In production environments, this is not a good idea. There the 90 seconds are much better, and because of that the 90 seconds are the default value. As you can see, this system here is looking for a queue that is named IMS02. What a queue is something you learn in the second video. More things can be said as well, but I like to say this is from a demo perspective the best minimum configuration. And then I can step with next to the installation of the server service. After this time lapse, you see the last screen of our configuration wizard. And this is the first time I can launch one of the identity manager components. There is the launchpad. This is the mother of everything, and that is the tool I will launch in a second. There is as well the manager, the main data administration frontend, and the designer, the main configuration frontend. If I install Launchpad, I can easily launch all of them, and so Launchpad is my choice just to start the identity manager. And as you can see, there is no authentication necessary, and the reason for is that it takes the authentication from the installation wizard out of all the properties we configured before. As you see in the overview, we install the identity manager database. There is a lot of other stuff I can do. I will show you that maybe a little bit later, but right now this is the case. What I like to show you here is what the identity manager is doing right now. Therefore, I just step on manage, and if I step on manage, I can check the system status, and that is exactly what I like to do. A very specific tool gets opened. This is only for project administrators. It's a very technical tool. It shows you what the identity manager right now is doing. And it's showing that in two windows. First of all, there is the window on the upper left. That is here the so-named job queue. These are processes just executed by the identity manager right now. This is post-installation, 857 jobs. I can just say monitor these jobs in the job queue. And what will happen is that I see all of them and I see the execution state true here, as runtime status says that these jobs are ready to get executed as long as the start time it's overdone. And now I just wait until all of them disappear. If you have a look at this count here, 844, you will see more and more of them disappearing from time to time. And that is a sign that your system works well. Additionally, I have a look into the DB queue. The DB queue is the calculation heart of the identity manager. Here a lot of database calculation happens. And if you can see right now the DB queue, it's just empty. For all the people don't want to watch these wonderful 844 jobs here, there is another very interesting thing available, and that is named the job queue progress. If I just click here on job queue progress, I see a color chart, and that color chart shows me that at the end, you can see that right here on the top, can let me see that all of these jobs here gets executed. Gets executed means that I see here something like a hill and a valley structure. Hills are always a lot of jobs, valleys are then more executed jobs. And if everything is green, that is really good in my system, especially because that means all can be executed. What I have to take care of if I look into that, by the way, is plateaus. Plateaus are never good. And especially if these plateaus have a red cover, then I have a lot of error situations in my database. But right now I don't expect something like that. I expect that very soon all the jobs are done. Last but not least, what I can as well have a look at is the job state. Job server state says these are my installed services. As you can see, there is just one available right now. It's on IMS02. This is the only service I installed during the installation. And as well, here I can check the status, not a problem at all. For example, I can hint here on the button. And this specific button will then have a look at server services. This is There is only one, I know, and if I hit the button directly next to this button, I can get here these wonderful blue icons. These blue icons says this server service returns. That means it is working. And if I'm interested in the details, I can right-click this specific entry and can say show in browser. And what will happen is that a browser front came up that shows me remotely a page of that specific server service. Yes, there's a warning that no encryption is configured. That's right, that is on my decision. But if I look into the log files, then I can easily see a lot of jobs in the meantime here in the log, all with green lines. Green lines is always good because that means these jobs was at the end executed successfully. Back to my job queue info. I wait now until all of the jobs are done. That means both queues are empty. And with that, you see both queues are empty. That means my system is in idle mode. And if I look into the job queue progress, then you saw all the jobs was just done by the system. Green was the available jobs ready to go, and blue was the executed jobs. With that, I'm quite happy about the first part of the installation and close my job queue info again. Next step is to show you the update installation, and I want to do that on an example. I will install the application governance. So I start the Autorun exe from my setup DVD again. I step to installation then before and run the identity manager installer. I step on next. I just check all the license agreements. I wait until both green check marks insist, and now the first change happens. I just select, because I have already a database, please have a look at the installation modules available, and I will check as well the add more modules to my selected edition. With next, I now need to select an existing database. There is only one available in my system. And now I'm able to select more modules I like to install. You see, there are a lot of them available. This is something you can read in the manual. The most of them are self-explaining. For example, here, Exchange or something else. What I like to do right now is to select just one of them, because that is then a short run. And I select the application governance module. With next, I get asked if I want to have if I need some more client tools here. Of course, no service components beside the client tool components like before. And with next, the system now tries to install all necessary software components on my machine. And after that, I can start with my upgrade. Once the installation of the client tools are done, then I can run again my configuration wizard. This time I have to update the database. And with updating the database, I have to select again my database. There it is. There is again the installation source. I click on Next. Now I have to confirm that I have a backup of my database. Not quite true right now, because I want to show you initial installation, but there is no big problem if I just waste my database. Configure the database, consistency checks are done. That is something I can do as well. Makes only sense if there's data in my database. And again, add more modules is what I like to do. And with next, I can add the application governance again. Again, think about, in the first run, we installed just software components on the computer. Therefore, I checked the application governance. Now I'm installing the application governance database module. And with next, there are some configuration wizards modules needs to be added. And the whole update starts. And as you can see, all database users are informed, everything is prepared. With next, the update starts in reality. The only thing I can see there is that a job service already is available. That means this job service here prohibits that the database can be updated, because it just shows active sessions. What that means is that I have to stop that job service. I can easily do that here directly with a PowerShell script. This is just on my demo environment. You might have other ways to stop that specific service. In my very specific case, I just stop that specific service now. And as you can see, the service is already stopped. And now I can finally start. With the advanced checkbox again, I can see as well what happens. I see the same 4 phases I saw seconds before. This time the complete installation will happen much faster, because the content to add is not that supersized than the content it was for the initial installation. So in an update installation, in difference to an initial installation, I have to sign into my database with an existing database user. This is now a good idea to have one. I can use, for example, VI admin. This is an out-of-the-box existing user. Always exist. If I set the password, then I should have the password available as well. In my very specific case, I have just created my own system user, so I can use this very specific system user to log in. And once that is done and I've been able to enter the database, then automatically as well my system update happens. And with that, my upgrade installation is done as well. I can start the Launchpad as it was before seen in the first part of the installation. And if I start the Launchpad, I can easily again switch to Manage. and there start my job queue info to have a look what my system is doing. As you can see, only one process this time, and if I look into the DB queue, then I see some more calculation jobs. This could generate some more process steps soon. So I just monitor my job queue, and in the meantime, before something could happen here, I will as well restart my server service. Therefore, I switch to my desktop, and at the desktop there is that shell script which allows me just remotely to install or to start my services. And with having the services started, I can look into my job server state. I can hit here the check button, and I see my services up and running. If this is not the case, by the way, you will see that with a yellow exclamation mark that says it is not working. You see in the meantime a lot of jobs again. This is exactly what happens before. And you should see in the database queue, of course, that more and more of these jobs are disappearing. With that, you are now able to work with the Identity Manager. It is 100% not necessary to wait until everything is in idle mode. That is one of the advantages of such an asynchronous working system. And there are only two things I like to talk about it before I end that video. And the first thing is to answer the question if it is possible to run both installations. That means to add the application governance module into an initial installation. Yes, of course, this is possible. Remember, on one of the first screens installing client tools, we saw these two checkboxes, and one of these checkboxes was named as Add Additional Tools. I can check this box. I can then select software components. I have to remember which software components are checked and do exactly the same during the database installation. That means running the installation wizard. I have as well to add modules to the database, and I have to ensure that the modules I added to the software components are just the same modules I added to the database migration. If I do so, then I will not run in any trouble and can easily completely install both. What is the reason why I typically don't do that? It's a practical reason. The default installation is of course something that gets very often tested, and with that a default installation typically runs through if I install initially the database. And I'm very sure that as well the installation of each single additional module gets often tested. And so I install then in a second run all the modules I like to add. What is very seldom seen and very seldom tested, or I'm not quite sure if this is the case honestly, is each combination during the initial installation of the default plus whatever else other module. And because of that, I don't try to test that. That is only for my safety. It is technically not really necessary to do that, but let me say it that way, from my practical experience, it is not a bad idea and a suggestion to do it as you have seen it. Secondly, and that is the last thing I want to talk about, this is the global installation time. You saw during the whole installation the one or the other bubble box that was talking about all the time that was processed during the installation. As you can see on my demo environment system here, we have now 3 in the morning. This is not really true for me because I'm living in another time zone and my server is as well living in another time zone. So I have noon here. You see morning on the server, but at the end, the only interest is the difference, and you can easily see the initial installation plus as well the upgrade installation was running in less than about 2 hours. So that's it for here. This system is now up and running and can be used, and you will see me then in the next video when I'm just installing additional server services and connect an Active Directory.